Hi folks, welcome to IMB Magazine. My name is Clive from MTB Skills and you're joining us for the Skills and Technique feature. Each issue we're going to be looking at different techniques and the core skills to riding mountain bikes. So sit back and relax and enjoy.
Well, how do you folks? Welcome back to another edition of our Skills and Technique feature. Well, it doesn't get much busier than that, and we're not talking about the busy crowded scenes of the finish arena at the World Championships from last weekend. Did anybody see it? What an amazing race. No, we're talking about busy on the trail. We're talking about little feature after little feature, maybe big feature after big feature, things happening really close to one another, and we've got to get all of our timings just right. And the subject about that is how we use our pressure, how we're weighting the bike and unweighting the bike to help us get through all these nadgery little lumps and bumps and the bigger hits as well. Enjoy. Now bear with us, we're getting into the nuances of some of these skills and techniques, and we've covered pumping and pressure and that in past editions. So go back and have a look through those and you'll kind of get the basics. But what happens in skills instruction is, well, one thing that happens is people like to put their own terms and phrases on things and coin something. So weighting, pumping, pressure are all in a nutshell the same thing. If you were just wanting to get somebody through the trail, you wouldn't get so heavy in the detail, and you'd probably be talking about using a bit of bounce of the bike to get airborne. And I err away from that when taking people from sort of zero and building them up, because you can easily stitch that into their technique and it's something that can come back and bite you later on. As I've mentioned in previous articles and episodes, if you're pressuring in at the wrong time, you can just stall yourself and hang yourself up. And in this terrain where we are now, that's very, very common that can happen. There's so many knobbly roots and knobbly rocks that if you get your timing wrong, you're just going to really hang yourself up, and that can be a trip OTB. Now, there are certain situations in mountain bike terms, particularly when you've got bigger, heavier bikes and or you've got to do much bigger lifts, where we will work off of additional suspension compression to rebound from. So we do kind of a bounce shape, and I really don't like to call it bouncing the bike, but we pretty much do. If anybody's watched Chris Akrig's latest edit, if you haven't, go and watch it, it's phenomenal. Maximum respect to Chris, he always entertains, and man, has that boy got some skills on the bike. You'll see in there's a few definitive times where he really loads up that big bike to get it up in the air and onto stuff, and you'll see the suspension compress. We've got a micro version of that, and this is where I say we're getting into nuances, because you've got to switch between these modes constantly in trail terrain. So we have a very small compression in front of this point here, and if I want to clear this into the downslope, I've got to get a lot of lift to do that, and I'm not going to generate enough lift from the compression that's just being generated by me rolling through here. I've got to add on top of that, and the way that I add on top of that is kind of to do an American style bunny hop, the old front wheel first and back wheel up. But I will preload and give the suspension some oomph. You can see that front fork compressing as I get lift out of it to get in a downslope. Now in this situation, you could simply just roll through here, that's fine. But you've still got elements of compression, unweighting, compression, unweighting all the way through. And if you can get your timing right, where you're loading up and releasing, then you're going to help the bike flow through there. And we always talk about back slopes and down slopes and the backside of features. If you can get that compression on that downslope, that's going to give you that nice free boost of speed. What we're not talking about, and something I don't like doing, is what we don't do and showing clips of what we don't do. But what we're not talking about is this just standing vertical bouncing of the bike. I've seen it in people's riding, I've seen it in clips online, and it's just complete wasted energy. It's not timed and synced to anything on the trail. Just let the bike move, let the bike make the shapes along those small undulations, and you'll feel when there's a time where you can add load to that and get that pumping shape through the compressions and letting the bike come light over the crest. Right, so from our first example where the shape is superfluous, we don't really need to jump that, and you could quite easily roll through that. But in order to jump it and get that back slope, we're using a lot of weighting, a lot of unweighting, and part of that is riding and working off the suspension. There's not enough compression force in there to not bring in some use of the suspension as well. And of course, you know, even though the guy or the girl's loading up the BMX and the trials bike, they're pushing their energy into the bike to get that rebound back out. If you introduced a shock, you've got another component that's going to move. So there is an element of suspension movement regardless. In this situation, it's a lot different. Now we've got much more of a compression through here to come up over these roots and into another compression. So Mother Nature, that big G, gravity, is doing the work for us here. We're naturally going to get loaded up as we come down into here, particularly when we're going that bit faster. If you're going slower, you're not going to get that same force acting. You're not going to get the same level of compression, and you might need to work your body and the bike a little bit harder to do so. But here, timing's everything. If we load up suspension here and do a bounce shape, we can easily get snaggled and hung up on stuff and stall us out. We want to avoid that. We want the natural shapes to work for us and use that natural shape to get that compression loading. Very little, if anything, in the way of bouncing happens here. And actually we've got a route that we can kind of cheat some of the lift with as well off of here to get down in there. But you can see it's very busy, there's lots going on. We're going to come through here a bit slower now and not do the jump through. And I still want to use that compression shape to unweight to get the bike to come light here, so that it's not impacting on this route, this route, this rock, this route. The bike's light and it can just skip across those things should it come into contact with them. So a bit more sedate on the pace this time. You can see the legs really work as we come up and over this point. I'm just trying to help lift that back wheel up and over to make it into the next compression and stop that rear wheel getting hankered up on something. It's all much more subtle and it's happening so much faster in this type of terrain, and the type of terrain you're going to see in this edition. On the bigger shapes, you feel it more, you feel it for longer as you go through the bottom of the dip. You feel the unweighting as you go over the crest. Much more sustained to it, it's much more obvious, it's much more evident. It's exactly the same thing happening here in this micro detail where we're getting these little bits of compression force and little bits of release and unweighting going on. But you just have to work much quicker because you're in that zone for a much shorter period of time. And it may be that it's a tight little shape, so you may be in it for a short period of time, but it may be very severe. You may feel a lot of load, a lot of energy build up. And that's the point where you need to be unweighting and not weighting into it, because you're obviously going to start to impact your rims. And I've got to say, I used the Rimpact inserts, absolutely amazing. And anybody who's not tried inserts, if you're in knobbly terrain like this, I highly recommend running a tyre insert, because if you do get that timing wrong, if you've come light out of something and you come down and you're going to impact and you want to pressure through again, you come into contact with root or rock, you can very easily be through and on the rim. So if you're in this sort of terrain, they're amazing. Right, so while we're cutting around the woods, having another good day in the office, we must remember that we need to hunt things out to bring you a feature for. So we come to play on this slab. It's quite a nice, fun little feature. It's an interesting one when it comes to weighting and unweighting, because the slab itself is one thing, but it's actually getting into this slab that's the tricky point. And we've got a combination. We've got this lump of granite that I'm stood on now, which involves unweighting to get onto it. And you've got a bit of momentum before here, so you can use a manual to do that. And there's probably no need to bounce off the fork in that regard, so we just really pull in a nice good manual technique and try not to get any compression off the fork, because obviously if we time that wrong, we're going to stall out on the way up. But what happens as we come over this piece of granite is critical now. We need to be carrying a little bit of momentum here, and we're going to get some compression forces and some weighting of us and the bike as we drop off into this low point where my bike's currently sat. And if we hang up in here too much, it's very hard to make the gradient up over the root and onto the slab, particularly for the fact that it's got a turn in. So it's very key to try and reduce those impact forces and reduce that pressure and that weight that's going to happen in this low point here, so that we can get up onto. And when we get up onto our slab, you can end up in like a teeter-totter moment here if you're not careful. As you come over that crest over there, you end up with the back wheel on this side, the front wheel on the other side. And if you've ever sat in that position, you'll feel that the bars go light and they want to flop left, right. So you've got to counteract that and use the torso to keep the bike on track. And the last thing you really want to be doing there, unless you really have to, is kind of pedaling. There's the risk of clipping a pedal on the granite as you go over the top, getting your pedal timing wrong, unweighting yourself awkwardly. So if you can carry momentum through this by unweighting and dealing with that compression force and helping go light in the bottom there and not getting hung up, all the better. It just means you can roll up onto it. You might need a little quarter crank, half crank, a little tap of the pedals to do so. But there's another great example of where we're using pressure, unweighting and weighting of the bike to get through a section of trail. Right, so another situation where we definitely want to be taking some weight out of the bike is to get through this little crux here. Obviously, there's more than one way through these things. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes there is only the one way, like a water bar, for example, would be a time where the only other option is to dismount and lift over it. So this is a situation where we want to unweight in order to not drop the wheel in the hole, because this is a perfect wheel grabbing sized hole. By the time we floated off this, we're going to be impacting that piece of granite, and it's all going to start to get front weight biased and very unsavoury. But we've got to be a bit canny here. This is one where we don't really want to use the bounce to get the bike up. Pushing vertically to rebound vertically, this is all moving forward. So we want to unweight that front wheel with a manual shape. And obviously the next thing that's going to happen if we just purely rely on a manual is we're going to smash our back wheel into that bit of granite. Could be another type of rock, could be a root in the ground, could be a stump, but we've got interference in there. And even though we're running that Rimpact Pro insert, we don't really want to be relying on it in this scenario. We're far better to pick the back wheel up, unweight the bike and lift it over and into that. And again, there's a little bit of compression in there, but I'm trying to load up the body and not bounce into the suspension to do so, and then pick the bike up using the feet. There's another example just a bit further on in this trail. It does keep you busy in here, as I said in our intro, so let's get a look at that one. Right, so just a few more meters down the trail and we come into another interesting crux. Again, we're into this situation of a hole. This time that gap's that little bit longer. We've still got nasty square edge material on the far side that we don't want to get hung up on. So it's imperative to do some unweighting here. If you were going much slower than we've seen in the clip, you could probably roll your wheel into there and then unweight. But it's very hard to pick that front wheel up when it's down below you. You know, it's not much lower than the rear wheel in this instance, but it's still going to be harder to get this shape going on to unweight the front and get it up onto that crag. So we're better to use almost a little manual shape. But the problem is we're getting very close to wheelbase and getting hung up here. So we've got to unweight the back wheel as well. So we do that and we can float that over by coasting on the front wheel and then landing into this downslope. This is a very interesting feature in the sense, and you'll come across these on the trail, that you've got two corners to make. You've got a right corner to make onto this or through this, whichever way you're coming about it, which is why people have been coming wider, although then the knock-on effect is they've got this big root down here to deal with. So you've got to make two corners. You've got the right corner into the left corner, and it's probably why on the last one I can just thread it straight through and gap it in one, and it's a much smaller hole, so you can do that little bunny hop shape, just unweight it and float over. Whereas in this one, if you tried to get the hop in, probably going to be going a bit deep into the next corner into the left. So if I get the front wheel onto it, I can still be braking, I can still be steering. You know, you can steer on front wheels. You see people doing that nose manual thing and they're steering around on that front wheel. So you get a bit more control in that. But we're really, you know, punching in very technical terrain here. Right, so up until now, we've been looking at gravity-fed stuff going down the way, but it's not all about going downhill. Some of you may be surfing the chairlifts, in which case this won't apply to you. There are plenty of us out there, myself included, that do like going up things as well. And that involves weighting and unweighting of the bike also. So in this situation, something I love about our local trails here in the south of Scotland is a lot of this stuff, as me and Dan were just chatting off camera, goes in reverse. And a lot of it presents some really interesting challenges when you start riding it in reverse. So here, climbing up through this section now rather than descending it, I need to use a power wheelie to get up onto this. I may be able to roll my wheel through this gap if I've got a little bit of momentum. You know, I might be able to pull a power wheelie over and bridge over and get onto the next bit of ground. But inevitably, I don't want to get hung up in there. It's just slow speed now. If I hit this with my front wheel and just bulldozer into it, I'm going to get pushed into the front of the bike. So really, I'm trying to get my pedal timing right, tap the gas, and at least unweight the front wheel as it comes into the second piece of granite there. Obviously, the back wheel is going to do the same behind me. It's going to stall out. It's going to hang up. I want to unweight it. And you're trying to get that unweighting shape going on while you still continue to drive the pedals round. And that really is about feeling the pressure through the cranks and being able to lift and pedal all in one motion. Stuff that's best practiced on the flat before you bring it into a more technical environment where it's littered with other hazards. So once we've cleaned this, we're up to our next crux, and this is where we will take a different line from when we're climbing. As you can see, the line through here is very similar to our descending line. We're just trying to straight line it out and not meander the long way around things. If you've got all that turning going on, it's much harder to be unweighting and lifting the bike about and making a meal of it. So trying to keep as straight as we can so that we can focus on unweighting the wheels as we go over the shapes. So this time, to get that straight line in, I mean, you know, you're really struggling on the breath bite here, particularly if you've come in right from the bottom of the trail. It's a long way up the hill. So we come round on the wider line, and then we've just got one crux in front of us. We need to get the front wheel up onto this. So again, tap of the gas, power wheelie, get the timing right. And if we just try and pedal through this, these off camber routes are starting to get polished up. It's all going to work the wrong way for us. You know, we're tempting to bring in that kind of turbo trainer moment where we wheel spin up, so we can eliminate that by lifting the back wheel up onto the shape. And again, that unweighting of the back wheel. There might be a little bit of pressure down at the bottom there to do that, a little bit of compressing of the body, compressing of the bike to get that rebound. But I'm going uphill. If I only do that, I'm going to stall out and I'm going to start rolling back down the way. So I've got to keep driving the crank on as I come over the crux point, so that as soon as I contact up on the top here, we're back into traction, we're back into grip, and we can pedal through and keep going up the next gradient. Super, right, so we've come out of the trees, so to speak, out of the trail anyway, into the forest road, and having had a massive brain fart myself, I'm trying to work out. That's all well and good in there, where it's very technical and very busy, showing you all of this stuff, talking you all through it. But the reality of getting up to that point, if you're only just starting out, is it's a fair way away just yet. So I spoke in there about practicing these shapes in an easier, open environment, a bit of a safer play zone. And it's relatively difficult to envisage shapes on the ground without there being shapes on the ground. And I think this is where pump tracks have huge value. They teach you these shapes. You get that up and over shape before you get compression to get rebound. So you can kind of feel your way through pump tracks and feel the shapes. Unfortunately, what pump tracks don't do for you, because they're very rhythmic and very smooth by nature, that's how they're designed and built, is they don't give you that sensation when it's kind of really just completely random, when the forces are very different, you know, like the size of those lumps in a pump track is very even and consistent. The size and the lumps we're talking about out here in nature are very, very different. The spacing in a pump track is very consistent. The spacing out here in nature is very different. So what you have out here, the timing is more like jazz. It's all over the place. Whereas on the pump track, it's much more fluid and rhythmic and consistent. So I'm just going to show you a couple of video clips of me basically messing around on the forest road here, and you can see me bouncing the bike and feeling that loading of the bike and unloading, loading and unloading before I go into a hop shape. And I'm trying to build up that amplitude. Now, actually what I'm trying to do is visualize myself riding up and over a hump, getting compression and using that compression force and that weighting to then unweight from and get that pop and that lift. And then in the next couple of clips, we're just doing some unweighting of the front wheel, that little manual shape unweighting of the back, and stitching those together quicker and feeling when the wheel hits on the deck, it compresses the suspension and my body's working with it. Obviously, I'm making all the right shapes above the bike to work from that energy and that loading up, that weighting of the bike to get it unweighted again. And the third and final clip that we've put in there is the reverse of that. It's actually going the other way. So it's unweighting the back wheel, rolling on the front wheel momentarily, and then flicking the bike underneath me to get down onto the back wheel again. It's a little bit more of a complicated shape. The best thing always is to go and play with it. I can give you all the words in my vocabulary to try to explain these things, but it's very hard to translate that into action on the ground. And that's where the value comes in, obviously, of going and seeing instructors. And you can tell the difference in instructors. There are people that have come to instruction and tuition from their riding background, and there are those of us that have come from a racing background. And us racers, we really beat ourselves up over things. We're really trying to like get every little ounce out of it, deconstruct it, work on it. And stuff that we were writing 15, 20, 30 years ago is different from stuff that we're writing and teaching now. Bikes have changed, our knowledge and understandings have changed. And so you will come across stuff out there on the interwebs in particular that may seem to be conflicting, may seem to differ. You know, forgive everybody involved. They're just trying to articulate something that's actually very difficult to put into words, because we're talking about feelings and sensations on the bike. And that really is the subject in a nutshell of weighting and unweighting the bike. It's working with those feelings and sensations, but more critically, it's about getting the timings right of when you work with them and which of the two techniques you use, whether it's just very gracefully unweighting the bike or being purposeful and weighting the bike. And in terms of getting it up into the air, like Chris Ackrig does in his latest edit, it's where you put that real big effort in and use the suspension and work off of the suspension. You see it with the downhill racers as well, loading up in corners and springing out of them and getting air on the way out. definitely advanced techniques. The key thing is timing, timing, timing. They've got their timing dialed. They've got the confidence to do that. You'll get there. Go out and work on it. Work in some easy stuff. Get yourself into more difficult stuff. You know, you've got to put those challenges in front of you because they're the things that really force you into focusing. But break it down, think about it, section bits of trail, and just keep working at it. And do join us again for our next edition of our skills and technique feature, where God knows what we'll be looking at, because generally we make it up on the day. But enjoy. Cheers, folks.